one form of nature. So people have always tended to consider atoms as balls, especially atoms of liquid. There was a notion, you see, that the atoms of the element of earth were cubes, because cubes all sit together rather firmly. Liquid, which when you put out good glue, that was balls. Fire was made of, if I remember rightly, pyramids. Air, I can't remember what air was made of. You know, what their atoms were shaped like. Maybe sausages or something like that, because air is pretty difficult to get at too. But they had some ideas. But fundamentally, what has influenced Western thought, and still influences Western thought, is the idea of an atom as some sort of fundamental little planetary system. And so these things come into relationship with each other, and they bang each other around, as in the game of billiards. And so if we are to understand the world profoundly, we have to find out what are the laws governing the relationship of the atoms. Now, you must understand, first of all, a principle about what are called laws of nature. We inherit the idea of laws of nature from our theology. And our theology that we've grown up with is in certain ways peculiarly different from the theologies of Oriental peoples. Jewish theology and Christian theology, which have entered very profoundly into the common sense of the average person, have an image of the world which is quite basically political, and we'll go further than that and say it's monarchical. It's based on the idea that the world is a construct evoked out of nothingness by the commandment of a celestial king. Now, there may be Jews in this room who are practicing and devout Jews, and there may be Christians in this room who are practicing and devout Christians, and I don't want to offend you by any imagery that I choose or remarks that I may make about this imagery, because I don't suppose that anybody has come to this room and to this particular place who is either a practicing or Christian Jew who has what I would call a naive idea of God. But the funny thing is about our ideas of God is that our symbols, the images, the mythological forms which we use to describe God have an extremely powerful influence on our feelings and on the way we behave. After all, I was a member of the Church of England when I was a small boy, and that had a very powerful effect on me. And in the Church of England, it's quite obvious, from an emotional point of view, as distinct from a very intellectual point of view, that God stands behind the King of England. And the King of England and the Archbishop of Canterbury and the whole hierarchy of lords and ladies and noblemen and officials who descend from this point are somehow involved, at any rate this is perfectly clear to a small boy, are somehow involved with the hierarchy of heaven. Because at morning prayer, to which we went every Sunday, the minister would pray a prayer which began, O Almighty Father, high and mighty, King of kings, Lord of lords, the only ruler of princes, who dost from thy throne behold all the dwellers upon earth. Most heartily we beseech thee with thy favour to behold our most gracious sovereign Lord King George, etc. And so this was a very courtly procedure at which the clergyman, dressed in his proper robes, proceeded to the altar, which is a kind of earthly symbol of the throne of heaven, made due obeisance, and presented this petition with all proper humility. Now, these are things that if you're brought up in that environment, you take for granted. That seems to be the natural attitude to God. But imagine someone coming in from a culture where God is not conceived in the image of kingship. How strange he would find this behavior. There's all this bowing and scraping, because you know very well that places where they bow and scrape and where there are thrones are places of terror. Because anybody who rules by force must be basically terrified. That's why he has to have all these protections, why he has to be addressed in the right form of language. Say you go into a court today, an ordinary U.S. law court. There is a very strict etiquette. And if you start laughing, the judge will bang the gavel and threaten contempt of court and all sorts of dire punishments. Because here, everybody has to be serious. It's like on the parade ground. All those Marines lined up, and they salute the flag, and they have to have a very grim expression on it. It's serious. And so, in the courts of kings, they have to be serious because kings are afraid of laughter. They're also afraid of being attacked suddenly. So everybody has to kneel down. Because if you kneel down or prostrate yourself, you're at a disadvantage. And the king stands or sits at his throne with his bodyguards ranged on either side. Be like that. We've already got the form of a church. The bishop at his throne, his attendant canons and clergy flanking him on either side. And so certain great Catholic cathedrals are called basilica. And basilica, from the Greek basileus or basilus, is the king. So the basilica is the court of the king. The very titles of God in the Bible, King of Kings and Lord of Lords, are of course borrowed from the Persian emperors. The Cyrus, which is the Greek word, Kyrios, meaning Lord. So the Mass begins with the invocation, Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy upon us. The titles are borrowed from the Persian emperor, and so the rites that have become associated with Christian religion are reflections of those great autocratic monarchs of the ancient Near East, the Cyruses of Persia, the pharaohs of Egypt, and people like Hammurabi, who were the great Chaldean monarchs. The universe was conceived then as being ruled on a political pattern like that, so that Hammurabi in particular, and Moses after him, they were the wise ones who laid down the rules. They were the patriarchs who said, now this is the way everybody's going to behave. And since you can't all agree among yourselves as to what the rules are going to be, I'm going to tell you what to do. And since I'm the toughest guy around here, and I got these brothers of mine who are pretty tough too, we're going to say, this is the law, see, and you got to obey. So this is how we have got historically the idea of there being a law of nature. That somebody told nature what to do. For example, a wonderful poem by Father Feeney about bees. God, to some sticky stuff not yet alive in a hive, said, come, hum, be my bee and buzz as I bid. And sure enough, it was, and it did. See, and in the beginning, let there be light. A commandment. So commandment is the fundamental idea. So the quest of the law of nature is the quest for the true understanding of the Word of God. For by the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the hosts of them by the breath of his mouth. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. What is that Word? If we could find out the Word of God, here is the idea, you see, we could perform incredible magic. That's why, for example, the name of God in the Bible is not to be uttered except once by the high priest in the Holy of Holies, once a year. Otherwise, that name, Yod-Heh-Voh-Heh in Hebrew, we don't really know how it was pronounced. And Jehovah mixes up those consonants with the vowels of Adonai. And then it's all mixed up in translation. But anyway, Jehovah is a polite way of saying what can't be said. Because if you know the word, if you know the name of God, you have power. You have the power of God. And so all ancient ideas of magic were based on knowing the names of God. It is said that there are 100 names of God, and 99 are revealed to us. And the camel knows the 100th name, which is why he looks so snooty. But so also, a person in what we now call primitive orders of society are loath to reveal their names. Because if I know your true name, I can utter it and have power over you. Now, you say, well, that seems a very naive idea, but it is exactly through the knowledge of names that we have Western science. And that is magic. That is through trying to understand the laws of nature. So that if you could understand the word, underneath all the phenomena, you could change the phenomena and create magic.
No, Viva, I haven't heard of that.
Only this, that many scientists have got rather sophisticated and have realized that the word comes later than the event.
But yeah, you should read Tao Te Ching. I just reread it again over the past week and put it on YouTube in 60-second clips. So it's very, very wise, and you'll have a lot of amazing moments while reading it. Feelings.
Beginning wasn't the word. Of course, if you want to make new sense out of the phrase "in the beginning was the word," you have to go to Hinduism, where they have the idea that Vak, V-A-C in Sanskrit, or speech, is the basis of creation. But by this they fundamentally mean vibration. As sound, you see, is... They say that is, you see, if you listen to sound and go right down into it, fundamentally get what sound is all about, you understand the whole mystery of things. Because the whole mystery of things is vibrating energy. On and off. Simple as that. Life and death. Life is on, death is off. Have to have off, to have on, have to have on, to have off. It's quite a relief. But there they say that's the beginning. Now, but they also say, in another sense, on another level, that the roots of Sanskrit, say the root form, say the word Buddha, comes from the root form Bud, which means to know or to be awake. Bhava, which means becoming, comes from the root Bhud, which means to grow. So on. Karma, doing, comes from the root Kri, to act. So they say, though, that the roots of Sanskrit are not simply the roots of the language, they're the roots of life. Because in another sense, altogether, you see, you create the world by the word. And this is something that we're not very conscious of. It's the way you think that determines your basic reactions to what happens. In the words of Shakespeare, there is nothing either good or ill, but thinking makes it so. Thinking is talking to yourself inside your head. And we, through this, build up all sorts of weird notions. We say, for example, well, one day you'll have to die. Have to. What's the emotional content of saying you'll have to die? It means it's going to be something imposed upon you against your will. So it's put in this passive mode, have to. You'll be compelled to die. But I can't be compelled to die unless I'm fighting it. Supposing I want to die. Supposing I commit suicide. Or supposing we look at it all in another way and say, when I get a disease and die as a result of it, getting a disease is something I do. Just as much as taking a walk. Only we've got our thoughts arranged so that we say, you ought not to get a disease. Even if it's just plain old age. Somehow, you ought not to do that. You ought to go on. You can't say, when death comes about, I laid me down with a will. Because we've got this hang-up about life being divided into two parts. Things that we do, on the one hand, and things that happen to us on the other. And Buddhists say, what happens to you is your karma. And people don't readily understand that. They think my karma, something awful happened to me because of something bad I did in my last life. And therefore, I've got bad karma. Karma simply means your doing, your action. So that when something that happens to me is called my karma, it means that it's your own doing. And if you recognize that it's your own doing, it's never bad karma. It's only bad karma if you refuse to admit that it's your own doing and merely blame someone or something else that it's something that happened to you. Now I digressed a little because what I was getting at was the meaning of a law of nature. The laws of nature were taken over. The idea of the law of nature was taken over by Western science from this ancient magical notion of the Word of God, the commandment of God, being the foundation for everything that happens in the world. But now, today, in Western 20th century science, there is an entirely new idea of the law of nature. The laws of nature are not things that exist in any real sense, which phenomena like the motion of stars or the behavior of animals and rocks, they're not phenomena which these things obey. The universe is doing its stuff. But because we have a certain kind of structure and brain, we want to make sense of it. And therefore, we find various ways of understanding the world by the principle of regularity. Now what's that? Let's take a clock. A clock ticks regularly. But the world does not tick regularly. Inconveniently enough, the sun does not have the earth go round it in a neat 360 days. This has always irritated calendar makers. How to make a rational calendar? There is no solution, because the rotations of the earth upon its own axis do not neatly synchronize with its rotation around the sun. There's always something a little odd about it. So what we do is we superimpose over this rather odd elliptical path the ideal figure of a circle with its 360 degrees. Now that is also like putting a ruler along a piece of wood and saying this piece of wood can be cut to 12 inches. Now there are no inches in the wood. Inches are a method, a technique that human beings have invented for measuring things. And so we can cut out of a piece of cloth or a trunk of a tree so many feet. Well, originally, it's simply comparing the trunk with us by putting our feet over it one after another, saying it's so many feet long. Or so many spans when you stretch out the hand. There's a fundamental idea of measurement, and the inch is, of course, one joint. Not your kind of joint. And so, this comparison of man's body and its regular shape, you see, 10 fingers on either side. 5 fingers on either side makes 10. 5 fingers on either side makes 10.
Follow a transcendental
And so by
formula
putting ourselves
either.
out, as it were, against nature, we measured it. And the idea of this, of measurement, is the same idea as the idea of the law of nature. A law of nature is exactly the same kind of thing as a ruler, or a hammer, or a saw. It is a way of thinking which enables us to control our environment. by observing regularities, and then by making a calculus, which is a process really of betting. Will it be regular next time? And the odds are that it may be. If it's done it once this way, it's likely to do it again that way. So in this way, you predict eclipses of the sun. You predict the phases of the moon. You measured, you counted how it went, how often it did it like this, how often it did it like that. And you say, well, it keeps on doing it. And you think, wow, this is fascinating. It seems to obey me, because now I can tell you any time it's going to come up. And if the other people around haven't figured it out, they think I'm magic, because I'm going to say to them, the moon is going to change at such and such a time. So many days from now, it's going to have a different shape. And they say, my God, he was right. And they think I'm making it happen, because I can do that. And so I get a rather privileged position, because I could predict. But that's the basic idea, you see, of the law of nature. The law of nature is a human network, like the lines of celestial latitude and longitude. They don't exist in the heavens, but we project them on the sky in order to measure the positions of the stars. Because the stars are scattered in a very confusing way. And just try and remember that mess and figure it out. But the clever ones, you see, just said, look at it through a network, a spherical network. You can number all the squares in the spherical network in accordance with the principles of the circle, the 360 degrees. You've thrown the network on the sky. It isn't really there, see? Then to help you a little further, pick out some of the big stars and see if they make a shape. You know, this is like doing a Rorschach test. And you see, oh, look, there's one over there that looks like a dipper. Or some people call it a plow. And there's one there that looks like a cross. There's one there that, by some extreme wangling, can be made to look like a virgin. And all these lines that join the constellations together are our ways of projecting a pattern upon this great and glorious confusion, so that we can remember it and chart it. But obviously, you can very well see that if you looked at this same pattern of stars from some completely different position in space, all those constellations and their arrangements would vanish. And you'd have to invent a new one. Because there is nowhere where the stars really are. It depends where you're looking from. So in this sense, then, man in nature, with his extraordinary symmetrical brain and its amazing complications, figures it out. And it's man who introduces the law into the world. He invents it. But in a way, invenire, to invent, is to discover. But what we discover, in a way, is not something that's out there. When we invent the laws of nature, we are discovering something about ourselves and our own passion for prediction, for regularity, for keeping things under control. Therefore, there has to be a law. So then, going back right now to the beginning of what I started to say, the question was then, what is the law of relationship between the atoms? Between the fundamental billiard balls of which the world is composed? Well, you watch the game of billiards, and there's a cue, and it hits that ball, and then it moves over, and it hits that one, and then that hits that one, and then that hits that one. And so the final ball, which moves into the pocket, has its behavior explained through its contact with the other billiard balls and the final contact with the cue. That's why it did it. And so this view of the world as something that happens by the mechanical processes of the law of cause and effect is one that is really basic to most people's common sense. today to most educated people. And it would say it's very difficult to figure it all out because the whole thing is so complicated. But if you could know all the details involved in, say, the behavior or a single act of a human, in what setting, so that you could say that my blood in my veins is in a certain setting. In a test tube, it's in a completely different setting. And in a test tube, my blood is not behaving in the way it behaves in my veins. Therefore, it's not the same thing. So, an individual person in one setting will behave in one way, in another setting in a completely different way. I remember when I was a child, I was one boy when I was at home with my parents. When I went to visit my uncle and aunt, I was someone different. When I was with my peers, I was someone quite different. Because I changed according to the setting, and children are very well aware of this. It's only as we go on that we keep having it drummed into our heads that we ought to have a consistent character, because we're influenced by novels where the characters are supposed to be consistent. And so you ought to have a consistent character. You ought to behave the same in all circumstances and towards all people. That merely means you become inflexible. So what things are, therefore, depend on the context in which they're found, upon their network relationship to everything else that's going on. And one of the reasons for this, which is going to lead us to something more profound but much simpler, is, of course, that the whole notion of a thing or of an event in nature and of causal relationships between different things and different events is a purely abstract idea that does not really fit the facts of nature at all. In nature, in what this physical world that you feel when you hold your head or hold somebody's hand or just breathe, in that world there aren't any separate events. None whatever. Sure, there are all sorts of wiggles around here, all sorts of lines, all sorts of colors, all sorts of surfaces, all sorts of forms. But they're not separate. Because you see, you can't separate an inside, what you are inside your skin, from the outside of the skin. Because you can see that at once. If there weren't anything outside your skin, there'd be no inside. It takes the outside and the inside working together to create this situation. And in the simplest way, the situation that I call my body wouldn't be operating unless there was air around here to breathe. This physical phenomenon goes with the situation of there being air. Now, true, it wiggles about inside the air in a rather complicated way. And other people watching say, oh, something going on over there. You know, because the air you can't see and it remains rather constant except when there's a gale. And so you don't pay much attention to it because it's always around. What you pay attention to is what changes rather rapidly. And you say, well, that's a that. Say, hey, you say to someone, you see the change going on, some wiggle over there, say, what's that? See? And he knows what you mean by a that. A that means something on the end of a finger point. It's different. It's peculiar. See? And that's a that. So from that comes the idea of an event, or a thing, a that. But all these that's that are happening aren't disconnected. They go with each other just as I go with the surrounding air. And just as this whole situation in which we are at this moment is a complicated going withness. Now here then we get to the fundamental idea, this idea of going with. And from this we shall be able to construct the whole notion of network. And this is the idea I said at the beginning. It is extremely simple, but very difficult for people brought up to use Western languages to understand. Now, going witness, we could call it relativity. relationship means simply, let me first of all put it in a very extreme form. Consider yourself, sitting here at this moment, being just exactly the sort of person you are. Maybe a little neurotic, maybe a little sick physically, maybe a little ashamed of yourself for some reason or other, or whatever. You know? Just the way you are anyway, just like that, sitting here. That situation goes with, as back goes with front, the entire situation of the rest of the universe. Now, you as you are, exactly the way you are, and you really don't know what that is. You may have some opinions about it, but you really don't know. That goes with the way the whole of the rest of boundless being is arranged. Now, it isn't that the way the rest of boundless being is arranged is determining you to be the way you are. Or if it is that, if that's true, if it determines you, then we must also allow the other side of the picture that you determine it. It's your karma. You did it. But you say, no, but I didn't help it. It did me. And you can say, test isn't. My two children arguing until you realize that the argument was stupid. Because you and it are one event. It isn't a question of it controlling you or you controlling it. It's all one event. As Teilhard de Chardin said, the whole universe is the only true atom, the only truly indivisible whole. The human being, though, finds this difficult to understand because we're always telling each other, now you should be different. You ought to change. Don't be like that. Now listen, you're sick, and I got a system. See, I got a system. I've got a real school here, a thing that's very important, and you should come and study with that. It may not be mine, but it may be some big sage or pundit that I know, and you should come around and study that. And I've thought about this for a long time, because I've heard every kind of opinion of all the sorts of things that I should do in order to get myself into shape. And I realized that if I followed this advice, I would spend my entire day doing exercises in preparation for life. I don't know when I'll ever get around to that. You know, I would have my half an hour's yoga practice, 1 hour of zazen, so much physical exercises, and so much memory practice, so much special diet preparation to be sure that I got proper food. And if I think this all through, I think, oh my God, it isn't worth it. Then another school of thought will say, no, that's the thing, you're getting confused. Just do one thing, see? But then I say, now how am I going to choose which one I'm going to do? Well, he says, obviously this one's the best. And before you know where you are, you're sewed up by some religious fanatic. Now, please, I don't want to do this to you. Please don't think that I have any such recipe that I'm going to give you anything to do for 5 minutes every morning. I just am not. I want to, my whole notion would be to set you all free so that you'd only have to attend one seminar, never have to come back. That's the idea, really. Because I know that so far as my own livelihood is concerned, that there are always more people. No, I don't collect the following and just send them all away. There are plenty more people to fill the vacuum. But this is the whole idea that we're going to work on of a net. That you are like a dewdrop on a multidimensional spider's web early in the morning. And if you look at that thing carefully, you will see that in every dewdrop there's the reflections of all the other dewdrops. So the way that dewdrop looks goes with the way all the other ones look. See? The particular glimmer in it and so on. Its peculiar position, and everybody has to have a peculiar position in the cosmos. The reflections in every one of them are different, according to the position they're in and the other dewdrops that they reflect at such and such angles. But nevertheless, the whole network, all the dewdrops, depend on each individual dewdrop. And each individual dewdrop mutually depends on all the others. And that's the sort of a scheme we're living in. And it a little bit affronts our logic at first, because we say, I can understand that I depend on this universe, because after all I need sunlight and air and water and the help of the society and all that kind of thing. I needed a father and mother. But looking at it from the other point of view, I find it very difficult to see how the whole thing depends on me. That's because we've been brought up with the put-down theory of the individual. No, children should be seen and not heard. You are the servant and subject of God, and don't you ask impertinent questions. Or another way of putting us down is to say we're just a piece of a fluke in a mindless mechanism. See? So we always managed not to find out that the relationship of the network is mutual. It runs both ways. That it depends on you just as much as you depend on it. Because you see, it's you, with your ingenious brain, that, for example, turns vibrations of air into sound. You turn whatever the sun is doing into light. You turn whatever the air is doing into a sky called blue. There is only blue for a brain. It's just like if you hit a drum and it's got no skin, it won't make any noise. So it's the tight skin that evokes the noise out of a moving fist. No skin, no noise. So you, as the reflector, like the dewdrop reflects, you, as the so-called reflector of all that goes on, by the constitution of what kind of a reflector you are, you evoke what we call sun, moon, and stars.
I was talking to the 17-year-old girl, not you, when I said the annoying thing, you know? And then they kicked you. But it was funny because you thought I was talking, everyone thought I was talking to you.
Oh man. So I'm listening to Alan Watts. It's an interesting lecture. I hope you have a great day, but I have to get going. And anything else you want to say before you hit the play button again?
Yeah, you're always on the run.
Yeah, I gotta get to the gym. Oh, she's always on the run.
Nebulae. Vast spaces. They're only vast in relation to you. They're not really vast. Only if you compare them with yourself, they're vast. They could be considered very tiny. Or equally, the space between two sides of a hair could be considered vast if you want to think about it that way. I mean, if you really want to go into a hair, an awful lot between one diameter of a hair, you know. And if you think about it a long time, you'll think it's what we call a vast subject. Study it. From microscopy, it is a vast subject. Depends on the attitude, you see. But the basic principle, the thing I really want to try and get across, is this idea of going with the universe around you is your outside, just as much as the organs inside your skin are your inside. You go with it in the same way that the stalk goes with the root or with the flower. And as front goes with back, as North Pole of magnet goes with South Pole. This principle of relationship governs everything. I wouldn't say governs. I'm only using these wretched terms that we have to use out of our language. It underlies everything. And it's important to realize, and let me repeat this, that the great universe does not control the small individual any more than the small individual actually controls the great universe. This is not a question of controlling. It is a question of more like dancing, of what happens, rather than what makes it happen. Things aren't made to happen. Only if you insist that a certain event is quite separate, then you can think of it being made to happen by the events that came before it. But if you realize they're all parts of one event, or different aspects, different phases of one event, then you see it happening and you don't see anything making it happen. Forcing that whole idea of things being made to happen, in other words, goes back to the idea of a universe that is based on a monarchical image, where the boss says, damn it, you do that, and the thing can't help it, and so it's made to happen. But say in Chinese Taoist philosophy, the universe is just not seen in that way. It's not seen as anything is not made to happen. It is what does happen. But it's all interrelated. And therefore there is a pattern to it. There is an order to it. The order of the net. Which is the two different concepts. I was talking in last night's session about the nature of networks, and you remember that I explained the two different conceptions of causal relations between things and events, and I may as well write these down unless you've forgotten them. There's the catenary and the reticulate. In this kind, things and events are explained as being links in a causal chain. And so every particular happening that is identified as a thing or an event, which is, however, quite an arbitrary kind of selection, is explained by its past, by the chain of events which lead to it in a causal sequence. On the other hand, in thinking of the reticulate relationship, a thing is explained not simply by its relationship to past events, but by its context, that is to say, its relationship to present and future events as well as past, so that every event becomes something in a network. Now, you will very well understand that when you see the knots in a network, or better, the squares of the net, they're all held together by each other. Imagine the kind of network where instead of there being, something like knitting. In knitting, the stitches are all held together by each other, and if something breaks at one point, the thing starts raveling. So, the reticulate view, or the net view of the universe, is one in which the Buddhists say everything mutually interpenetrates everything else. So, as I was trying to make the central point, the point of implication, point of relativity, that things go together like two sticks standing on the ground in this way. You see? They give each other mutual support. Or like the three rings in the Ballantine beer trademark, or the Christian symbol of the Holy Trinity. Those rings interlock. But take one of them away, and the interlocking is broken down for all of them. So in the same way, the individual, although seeming to be something that rattles around in the universe, Although a given planet or a given star seems to be something that is moving on its own, the motion, the behavior of stars, is a situation that arises only because of the mutual interdependence of all stars. Because, to take a very simple illustration, if there is only one star in the whole universe, no motion can be ascribed to it. It can't even be said to be still. Nobody knows what it's doing because there's nothing for it to relate to. But take two stars, and they can get nearer to each other or further away from each other. But no one knows which is moving. Get three stars, and then you have, say, two close together, and one of them seems to go away. Now, who is moving away from who? Are the two stars saying, hey, we don't like you, we're going to get out of your way? Or are they saying to the other star, why don't you like us? Why do you keep going away? Well, who's right? Well, you can say on the principle of democracy that the majority must be right. But then they say, well, let's have an umpire, and we'll have a fourth star who can stand above us. You see, two stars can only move in a straight line with respect to each other. Three stars can move in a plane with respect to each other, but a fourth star can establish a third dimension, where we can say, I can look down on you and take an objective standpoint. But then the argument is which one of them is the fourth. But that's the basic principle on which the whole universe is constructed. It's a relativity system in which motion depends on comparison with something relatively still. And there can't be any motion at all unless there is that comparison. So, because of this relationship, every individual is so related to everything else that's going on that you imply it. In other words, anybody who was a great scientist from some other world altogether, who studied a human body carefully and figured out the conditions under which such a thing would exist, he would come to the conclusion that that human body was something from a universe just such as we have. He would find that your structure, your behavior implied this whole thing. Just as with a laser beam system, you can photograph a small fragment of any photographic negative, and from that tiny fragment you can reconstruct the whole picture from which it was taken, because the crystalline tensions in that fragment imply the whole context of crystalline tensions that belong to that particular negative. So in exactly the same way, you as an individual imply this world, and this world mutually implies you. And you are a natural formation, moving in and with this universe, not determined by it, because this is not a system of determinism. But you are moving with it in just the same harmonious way that you notice the waves moving, and the trees growing, and the clouds moving. And as you don't accuse the clouds of making aesthetic mistakes, so really is a certain light in which you can see human beings, both good and bad, as perfect forms of nature. You may have fashionable discriminations about who is beautiful and who is ugly. You may have metaphysical discriminations about who is sick and who is healthy. You may have moral discriminations about who is good and who is evil. These are all points of view, relative points of view. They are all legitimate because they are parts of the functioning of the whole. The fact that you take those points of view, that too is part of nature. But a skillful person lives on two levels at once. You live basically on the level where you know there are no mistakes. There can't be. Everything moves in accordance with what the Chinese call the Tao, the way of nature. And if you have that basic feeling, you will always be sane. But you are able to comprehend within that feeling a more restricted point of view, whereby things are good and bad. Just as in the confines of this room and this area, it's perfectly clear that there's a difference between the up direction and the down direction. But we know that this area is situated in interstellar space, and there is no up and no down. Now, the second situation doesn't contradict the first. But if you have only the discriminatory point of view, if you take your fundamental stand as a being on the difference between good and evil, you get in the Christian hang-up. You have then to say that there is eternal heaven and eternal hell, that the distinction between good and evil is radical. And if you do that, you begin to suffer from a disease called chronic guilt, which is one of the most destructive emotions that anybody can have. You feel an outcast from the universe, at odds with reality itself, at odds with God. And that sends people quite mad, and is responsible for a good deal of the craziness of Western civilization. It's making too much of a good thing out of the distinction between good and evil. It is an important distinction, but it's not fundamentally important. And you have to learn to admit different degrees of importance. And just say that because you can't just say that because a certain distinction isn't absolute, that it's not important. After all, your own physical formation is not absolute, but it's important. So, the situation of man in this network is to repeat the proposition. On the one hand, that he as an organism, psychophysical organism, is something that the whole cosmos is doing. That was as much of truth, I think, as there is in modern astrology, which I regard as a pseudoscience. But it is based on a very fundamental principle. And when you draw a map of a person's soul, you draw a small picture of the universe, a very crude picture. And that is the design of that person's individuality. The truth is, therefore, that your soul is something which contains your body. Your body does not have the soul inside it like a spook. And the whole cosmos is your soul. So the cosmos is doing you at the point you call here and now. Reciprocally, you are doing it. And the one depends upon the other. You have difficulty in conceiving this as a Westerner because we have all been brainwashed by several centuries of put-down theories of man. That you were A, the wretched little subject, and a disobedient one at that, of an eternal king, and B, that you were just a fortuitous congress of atoms in a mindless mechanism of incredible vastness. Having entertained those two theories of man and of existence for so many centuries, we are very much brainwashed into being unable to see that we and the universe are mutually causative, or to use the Chinese expression, mutually arising. Now then, a second difficulty arises in this, which requires that I bring in some ideas, first of all, from Buckminster Fuller. The principal notion of Buckminster Fuller's thought, and if you don't know this name, Buckminster Fuller is what I would call a philosophical engineer, a man who is one of the most creative minds in the modern world. He invented the geodesic dome, which is his main claim to economic fame. But beyond that, he's done a great deal of extremely fascinating thinking about the future of technology and the situation of man in